This week on the West Block.
And today we're grateful for Canada's resolute support of the Ukrainian people after Russia's reckless and lawless invasion.
Washington leads Western allies in stepping up military support for Ukraine, despite a warning from the Russian president not to intervene. We speak to a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander about the implications if the war escalates. The Liberal government calls a public inquiry into its use of the Emergencies Act to end the trucker blockades.
The judge will have broad access, including to classified documents.
But the opposition says the government is not being transparent enough when it comes to revealing all the information. We sit down with Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino.
Uniting this country.
And we have a one-on-one with Conservative leadership candidate Roman Baber as the race to be the next leader heats up.
I'm running to shake up our party because many Canadians feel that in the last couple of years, the party refused to speak up for them.
It's Sunday, May the 1st, and this is the West Block. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm David Akin. The U.S. Defense Secretary held an extraordinary meeting last week in Germany with 40 different countries to shore up more military aid for Ukraine.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine.
The White House has also asked Congress to approve a $33 billion aid package for Ukraine. So what does this mean for what's happening on the ground in that country? I'm joined now by retired U.S. General Philip Breedlove. He is a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. He's also the Distinguished Chair at the Middle East Institute. General, thanks so much for joining us. And I'm sure you took note of that conference in Germany. You heard what Defense Secretary Austin said. If you were a commander and he told you we need to weaken Russia, what does that mean? How are we going to measure it? And how does the U.S. and its allies like Canada go about this process of weakening Russia?
It's an extraordinary statement. And David, thanks for having me on your show. But it was not the only extraordinary statement. The fact that we are starting now as a policy to use the word win, in other words, enabling Ukraine to win this war, that is extraordinary. And then to hear those words, which is a whole nother level of ambition for what this war might turn up as far as weakening Russia. I would offer that we've already weakened Russia. They suffered a strategic defeat in the north around Kyiv. They lost a lot of vehicles, a lot of men and equipment, and it's going to take them some time to dig out from under those problems.
This war, of course, has so many unintended consequences for Putin. Most wars have unintended consequences for their aggressors. Obviously, he cannot have expected the West to show the unity that is shown, but he is now about to get Sweden and Finland to join NATO, or that it looks very much like those two countries are not going to remain neutral any longer in that whole strategic area of the world. What does that mean to NATO? I'm assuming, Sweden's got some submarines, Finland's got a terrifically well-trained military. What would that mean to NATO to have Finland and Sweden as part of the alliance?
Well, in a certain way, they've already been a part of the alliance because they're partner nations and they have been exercising a lot with us. In fact, no disrespect to some of our newest members who come from the Warsaw Pact background. These two nations are almost completely compatible with NATO now. Their tactics, techniques, and procedures are the same. Their equipment is all compatible, if not compatible, interchangeable with ours. And so these are two nations that have great military capability and also a lot of experience fighting Russians over the years. And they will bring an immediate capability to the alliance. I welcome it. I would have liked to have seen it when I was the SACEUR.
Obviously, Putin has been making all sorts of threats. He certainly doesn't want to see Finland and Sweden join NATO. This week we saw, or last week I should say, we saw Putin use the phrase, any allies that interfere with Russian forces in Ukraine will suffer a lightning-quick response. I'm assuming that's got to mean missiles. What did you take of that? And do you think it's an easy job to differentiate Putin's bluster from what may be a credible threat?
Well, first, let's just examine what he's doing. To his credit, he has deterred NATO, the EU, and the West in an incredible way. Look at all the things that we're not doing, that we say to him and we remind him that we're not doing. And so we are deterred. And now I think we're beginning to take those steps to try to climb out from under that deterrence. And what we see is Mr. Putin trying now to use even more inflammatory and scary language to further deter us from taking action. And I think it's very good that the West is now stepping up to the plate and starting to take those steps that would begin to reverse that deterrence.
You've been on the record saying we tried sanctions years ago. We tried sanctions in 2014. We're doing sanctions again, and they are not changing the behavior of Putin's regime. So if not sanctions, though, what are some of those steps that you're looking at and seeing now that the West, Europe, the United States, Canada need to do? What's beyond sanctions?
Well, when I teach at university, I use a simple model called DIME for the American coin: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. Diplomatically, we should be going after Mr. Putin right now. People are saying we can't remove him from the Security Council. Why not? If this is not the time, and if the reasons his horrible war on the civilian population of Ukraine, if this is not the mode to make that change, then shame on us for not trying. We need to move out. He should not be going to the G20. We need to eliminate Russia from the world stage over how they are comporting this war. Informationally, he has a massive disinformation campaign now aimed primarily internally at his own audience, but we need to be outing him with the truth. Militarily, we need to start taking those steps that the defense minister spoke about at Ramstein, and we need to keep enabling Ukraine to win this war. And then economically, keep the pressure on. The sanctions aren't a waste. It's just that history has determined over and over and over that it's not, that alone will not change Mr. Putin's actions.
Now, General, I wanted to get your opinion about the capability of the Russian forces as they gear up for new attacks in the east. They've redeployed some forces from Kyiv down into the east, into the Donbass. They've got a new general. Is it that simple? Should we expect the Russian forces that failed so miserably in the north to all of a sudden be successful?
Yes, so this is hard, and they only took a couple of weeks, and not a lot of structural problems are not going to change in 2 weeks. But for sure now they have unity of command and unity of purpose under this new commander. And we already see a little bit more discipline on the battlefield. They are moving slower than maybe they wanted to, but they are showing some differences. They will encounter the same logistical problems and other things that they have before. So it's not a done deal in the East, and we need to get there now with our aid to the Ukrainians. We're sending aid, but it's hitting the western side of the country now, and it's a long way away from the fight.
Philip Breedloves, thank you so much for joining us today. Very much appreciate it. Up next, convoy blockades, the Emergencies Act, and now a public inquiry. Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino joins us next.
You're watching the West Block on Global.
In court, in Parliament, and very soon at a public inquiry, the federal government is defending its use of the Federal Emergencies Act to deal with the convoy protests of last February. And the man at the center of each defense, pretty much, is Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino, who joins us now. Great to be here. Great to have you on set. It's good to do these things in person.
Yeah, good to see you, David.
I want to go back to that. The cabinet discussions you were having. The protests are underway. The Windsor Bridge is blocked. Coots is happening. The protest is here. And we heard from Minister Lametti, Minister Blair, probably from you, that the police have all the authorities they need to deal with it. The Windsor blockade gets cleared. And then something changed and you declared the Emergencies Act. That was the sequence of events. Windsor's done. What happened or what was the information that you and your cabinet colleagues got that said, no, we need the Emergencies Act now?
Well, at the time, we were looking not only at one particular port of entry, but the entire country.
We had Emerson, we had Coutts.
You got it.
Yeah.
White Rock at the Pac Highway in BC, where, by the way, people who were engaging in the blockade had taken an armored vehicle and rammed it into a barricade that had been set up by the CBSA, posing a real threat not only to law enforcement but to other people who were trying to get through. We had the situation in Emerson in Manitoba. I recently had the chance to go there, where there were obstructions to important critical supply chains. We had the situation in Coutts, where on February 15th, as you may recall, significant criminal charges were laid.
We have attempt murder on officers.
Attempt murder, firearms, conspiracy to commit murder, Ambassador Bridge, where, yes, you're right, we'd made some progress, but where there were threats that blockades could come back. There was a threat that had been made against the mayor of Windsor, Drew Dilkins, at the time, involving his own personal safety. There was the situation here in Ottawa, which was a town that was laid to siege, and every time law enforcement would try to come to the downtown core here at the foot of this building, they were swarmed.
But
they were threatened.
What was it
so
in that
it was
couple of days?
I guess
then?
what I'm getting at is that we were continuing to monitor the situation very much in real time, looking at the totality of the situation, which in our judgment, combined with the advice that we got from law enforcement, that existing authorities on the books were not effective, and that is the operative word, at restoring public safety, which is why we ultimately invoked the Emergencies Act. When we did it with a limiting principle in mind, and as soon as we could revoke, we did.
So to parse that back, it's fair to say it was mostly the security issue was the more overriding issue than, say, economic harm.
No, it was all those factors. So, and we laid out in a background document when we tabled it in the House of Commons, when we brought the motion, and we placed it in a couple of big buckets. One was the economic impact, which I know you're going to come to. The second was the international concerns raised by some of our closest allies.
Let me just stop there. How important was that? Because clearly the Biden administration, there was elected officials in Michigan who were saying, why are we doing business with
You're absolutely
Canadians?
right. So the governor of Michigan raised it. The president of the United States raised it. U.S. labor raised it.
But that was a factor for cabinet, as the relationship with the United States.
No question. And we wanted to make sure, and I was in touch with my own counterpart, Secretary Mayorkas, and he was very supportive at the time, asking if there was any way that they could help from the Michigan side of the border. That was another factor. And then obviously, most importantly, the safety of the lives of Canadians. And look, for those who want to go back and engage in some revisionism and suggest this wasn't a serious public event, I would encourage them to take into account the fact that there were literally hundreds of charges that were laid, criminal investigations, as a result of the independent decisions of law enforcement, who were, for large tracts of the blockade and the occupation here, overwhelmed deliberately, consciously, by those who are blockading.
Now, I mentioned those three things, those three arenas where the government is being asked to defend itself for the use of this. That's obviously one of the purposes of the inquiry, is to examine, was it that in fact justified? And I know there's been a lot of discussion in all those fora about cabinet confidence, et cetera. Not really want to rehash that issue, other than to say, when Judge Rouleau gets a chance to look at some documents that the public may not get to see, will he get a chance to report on that? Will there be a redacted part of his report that once he files once this inquiry is done? What is that inquiry report going to say at the end of the day to Canadians?
Well, ultimately, what it will say to Canadians will be up to Judge Rouleau, and we've afforded him the full-scale powers of a commissioner to compel witnesses, to compel documents, to compel information, including classified information, so that he has all of the record that he needs to not only take a look at the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which again we're confident was the right call to make in all the circumstances, but equally to make some practical and tangible recommendations going forward so that it never happens again. You
guys, when I say you guys, cabinet, obviously having been through that, have a good idea on how to make sure that doesn't happen again. Either blockades at border crossings, mostly blockades at border crossings. I know it was hell here in Ottawa. I lived through it myself, but it was really that blockades at border crossings that causes real international, potentially, damage.
There was definitely an impact there, for sure.
So what have the CBSA, I mean, some of the agencies that you're responsible for, the CBSA, the CSIS of the world, Have they already learned some lessons from that?
I think we all have. I certainly hope that we all have. But I would just point out that while it's important that the government have those discussions internally within the community of public safety and national security, that it's equally important that we look outside of government to get some advice, including from independent public office holders like Judge Rouleau, and to also branch out into the community to learn more about what the impacts were, what was driving the illegal occupation. And I would highlight that I am concerned in my capacity as Minister of Public Safety about the ideological extremism that sparked the occupation here in Ottawa and the blockades. As you'll recall, there was a manifesto that was published that demanded that all vaccine mandates be revoked, or else the Governor General should unilaterally remove the Prime Minister from office.
They were a bit misinformed on how our government works, but
indeed, they were absolutely misinformed, but nonetheless, exactly, it incited thousands to descend into the nation's capital. You also had some organizers come right out and say that the only way this thing's going to end is with bullets. And then subsequent to that, you do have conflict.
Were you getting any information that some politicians' lives were being, if not lives, physical safety was in fact being threatened?
I was worried about everybody. I was worried about public safety. I was worried about national security, and we were taking this situation extremely seriously. Because it was. And I would point out that there's, I think, a very conscious, deliberate effort by some within our political discourse to try and diminish and engage in some revisionism. I think that's reckless. We took a responsible decision. We have a burden and a responsibility to protect Canadians. We didn't want to invoke the Emergencies Act. We were always, I think, very reluctant to invoke it.
It was there for 10 days, just to
very briefly. And, I think that is a direct rebuttal to some who would say this was going to be an effort at overreach. No, it was a very time-limited, very targeted and charter-compliant act which we invoked, and then we revoked it as soon as we could.
Marco Mendicino, Minister of Public Safety, thanks so much for coming in. Really
Thank you, David.
All right, up next, Conservative leadership candidates continue to crisscross the country looking for votes, and one of those leadership hopefuls joins us next.
You're watching the West Block on Global.
It costs $300,000 to get into the Conservative leadership race, and all that money had to be into party HQ as of Friday. Our next guest made that cut. Roman Baber is an Ontario MPP elected as a Progressive Conservative in York Centre in 2018. But last year, in 2021, Roman was ejected from the PC caucus by Doug Ford because he objected to lockdowns and other public health measures. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But first, welcome, Roman. And I wondered, first of all, raising that kind of money, that's a lot of money, so you need a lot of people to support you. Tell us who your base is. Older, younger, urban, rural, east, west. What's the Roman Baber base look like? Who's your supporters?
David, thank you. Indeed, I'm now a verified leadership candidate. We have raised the $300,000 and the necessary signatures from across the country. And look, we're a truly grassroots movement made of Canadians coast to coast that are concerned about the erosion of Canada's democracy and Canada's opportunity. Our message on the need on restoring Canada's democracy is resonating with voters. And we're in the habit of exceeding expectations with our campaign, and I hope that we'll continue to do so.
Let's talk about sort of the obviously you're sort of thrust into the national spotlight, if you will, as a legislator who left your caucus over the issue of lockdowns. Lockdowns was a big animating force in the last election, and that, as you say, looking to restore some choice, some democratic values, etc. But this, if you win the leadership, the Conservative leadership, you may not see an election until 2025. Is that still going to be an animating factor in 3 or 4 years?
Look, I think it's an error to think that I'm running on COVID or lockdowns. What we're running on, what I'm most focused on is the erosion of Canada's democracy. We're watching still more than 3.5 million Canadians cannot board a plane or a train. Many Canadians are forced to choose between their health and their ability to put food on the table.
But Roman, hold on. Surely in 3 or 4 years, those 3 million Canadians will be on a plane because the public health measures will have changed. Like, in other words, what I'm suggesting is you're fighting yesterday's battle, not looking forward to. We had James Moore and Brad Wall on last week that said Conservatives have to focus on the economy. That's the most important thing.
If I may, David, and of course I'm going to focus on the economy. We're printing money. Our 1.3 trillion debt is unsustainable, and I intend to introduce a very robust energy and natural resources plan, also a housing plan. But in the moment right now, we still have close to 4 million Canadians that are subject to unprecedented discrimination. But beyond that, beyond the public health measures, we are seeing unprecedented censorship by government, professional regulators, and social media. We just saw the seizing of bank accounts without a court order using what I believe to be, eventually will be found, an unlawful emergency declaration. We see Quebec Bill 21, which prevents Canadians from practicing their faith without a bona fide occupational requirement.
What you just said, I've heard a lot from, let's say, Leslyn Lewis, who is against Bill 21, forcing people to divulge vaccination candidates. What's wrong with Leslyn Lewis, says the leader? She ran last time. A lot of people liked her. Why are you a better choice than, in this instance, Leslyn?
I have a lot of respect for Leslyn, just like every other candidate. I would say one distinguishing factor between myself and many other candidates, as you have mentioned, I was asked to leave the Progressive Conservative Caucus in January 2021 in my opposition to the lockdowns. I was not afraid to speak out against the mainstream narrative, against the prevailing culture of the day. I put my political career on the line because I wasn't going to continue watching the collateral effect of lockdowns potentially perpetrate remarkable harm on Canadians. And that's what voters can always expect from me.
Let me ask you then about Pierre Poilievre's candidacy. You've seen the crowd sizes he's getting. Your crowds aren't too bad either. I've been watching your social media accounts, but he's getting some remarkable sized crowds. Polls say he's the front runner. He too is all about freedom, doesn't like gatekeepers. You've heard his the phrases he uses. Why are you a better pick again than Pierre Poilievre, who's currently in the House of Commons? He won't need to run in a by-election if he becomes a leader.
Again, just like with Leslyn, I think that Pierre's a very good candidate. He's articulate, he's intelligent, and I think that once we end this leadership race, I hope that we all come out united. I do have some distinguishing facts with Pierre Poilievre. For instance, I oppose Quebec Bill 21. I'm not sure that Pierre has the same position. I would also not seek to protect supply management. I would seek to phase it out. But again, as I would say, I have been on the democracy message from day one. I felt that we have an obligation to Canadians, and we should not fear to stand up to Justin Trudeau or cancel culture, or those that said that we need to lock down 35 million Canadians and make them sick. And I don't believe that any, in fact, of the leadership candidates articulated that message clearly until the truck convoy came to town.
Roman Baber, good luck in the race, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David.
That is our show for this Sunday. Thank you so much for watching. We hope to see you next Sunday. For the West Block, I'm David Akin.